Hello and welcome. This is the Commonwealth's motion to exclude the testimony of Dr. Marie Russell and request for a Daubert hearing. And in a previous video, I went over what a Daubert hearing is, but if you don't remember, a Daubert hearing is when a judge is permitted to go through the credentials of an expert witness and to ensure that the credentials and the expert witness meet the criteria to qualify as an expert witness. So there are prerequisites, there are rules under the Daubert-Lanigan doctrine, and those rules require that the judge ensure that the expert witness is truly an expert witness. But at the same time, the rules give the judge agency. As I said in the previous video, Judge Bev could just decide on her own volition that Dr. Marie Russell, the dog bite expert, doesn't meet the criteria as an expert witness, even if she does. Even if Dr. Russell does meet the criteria. It's subjective when it comes to the judge, and we all know how subjective and biased Judge Beverly Cannoni has been. So, the motion reads, the Commonwealth respectfully moves this honorable court to exclude the defendant's proposed expert testimony of Dr. Marie Russell because 1. The defendant failed to prove that the testimony meets the requirements set forth in Daubert v. Merrill and provides the case law, and Commonwealth v. Lanigan. And number 2, the defendant failed to prove that Dr. Russell is a qualified expert in the field of canine bites or claw marks, veterinary medical science, forensic odontology, or canine behaviors. And 3, the testimony cannot be reliably applied to the facts. Okay, just so those are the 3 reasons why the Commonwealth doesn't want Dr. Marie Russell to testify during the retrial. And if you guys remember, during the last couple of hearings, it was determined that there will in fact be a Daubert hearing in which Judge Beverly Cannoni will decide if Dr. Russell meets the requirements. I just don't like that the prosecution doesn't even have a dog expert of their own. And number 3 in the prosecution's motion claims that the testimony of a dog bite expert cannot be reliably applied to the facts. Like, as if the prosecution is yet again ignoring the fact that John O'Keefe had dog bites on his body when he died, and claw marks on his body when he died, and that there was in fact a dog inside 34 Fairview when he died, and that dog was Chloe. And a few months after John O'Keefe died, Brian Albert and Nicole Albert allege that they sent Chloe, the dog, to Vermont. But as I have said in previous videos, a lot of people online believe that Chloe was euthanized. If you think about it, like if Chloe was partially responsible for John O'Keefe's death, and then after John O'Keefe's death, Chloe hospitalized 2 women. This was brought out during trial. 2 women had to go to the hospital after John O'Keefe died. Months after John O'Keefe died, 2 women had to go to the hospital because of the dog Chloe. But the prosecution is acting like a dog expert witness and the facts don't add up, right? It's just more obfuscation from the prosecution. They don't want to get down to the truth. They want to win the case. Continuing. Procedural history. On May 21st, 2024, the defendant provided the Commonwealth with the curriculum vitae of Dr. Marie Russell, a proposed expert witness not previously disclosed, Exhibit 1. Defense counsel reported to the court that they first engaged with Dr. Russell on May 17, 2024, and that provides a voir dire. On May 30, 2024, during the 6th week of the defendant's first trial, and after the Commonwealth had called over 50 witnesses, the Commonwealth received the following limited synopsis about Dr. Russell. However, the Commonwealth never received any written report or opinions. And it reads, she has reviewed the autopsy photos, grand jury testimony of Dr. Scordy Bello, the entirety of the autopsy report, all reports associated with Chloe's prior bite history, photographs of the items in evidence, and the UC Davis DNA testing results and evidence submission forms. She is expected to be called with focused testimony related to the right arm injuries sustained by Mr. O'Keefe. Dr. Russell will testify that the wounds and injuries on Mr. O'Keefe's right arm are consistent with an animal attack, namely teeth or claw marks, or a combination of both, from an animal. She will also testify that these injuries are inconsistent with having been struck by a vehicle, road rash, or scratches from broken glass or taillight material. She will base her opinions and conclusions in part on having treated hundreds of patients in the ER with injuries sustained from animal attacks, including dogs. Yeah. And I mean, for the prosecution to have an issue with this synopsis, when in fact the prosecution did not finish their discovery until after trial had begun. The defense had to wait to receive everything they requested during discovery. They had to wait until after trial had begun. So in my opinion, the prosecution has no room here to complain about when they received the synopsis pertaining to Dr. Russell, when in fact the prosecution wasn't on their A game. And in my opinion, as well as plenty of others, Dr. Russell appeared to be rather credible. And for someone to have experience specifically with dog bites and to make the determination that John O'Keefe in fact had dog bites and dog claw marks on his body, to me, should push the prosecution to want to find the truth, to want to get down to the truth, to want to figure out how John sustained those injuries when it was the Alberts and the McCabe's who told the MSP that John O'Keefe sustained his injuries from Karen Reed backing into him, right? And the MSP themselves came up with those stupid conclusions with their so-called accident reconstructionist Joe Paul. Like for the MSP and the prosecution to completely ignore and leave out John O'Keefe's dog and claw marks means that the MSP and the prosecution do not want to get down to the truth. Continuing with the prosecution's motion, on June 6, 2024, the Commonwealth moved to exclude Dr. Russell due to the defendant's failure to comply with the Mass RCRIM P14 and renewed its request for reciprocal discovery by seeking court-ordered production of the required expert proffers, opinion evidence, and all expert reports. See Exhibit 3. On June 18, 2024, the court ruled that the defendant violated Mass RCRIM P14 for the failure to comply with reciprocal and expert discovery. The only remedy to the Commonwealth was an opportunity to conduct a voir dire examination of the defendant's experts, including Dr. Russell, 2 months into trial on June 18, 2024. Provides the attachment, the exhibit. Following the voir dire hearing, the court permitted Dr. Russell to testify and render an opinion that the abrasions on the victim's arm quote, were inflicted by either teeth or claw marks, end quote, and consistent with a, quote, large dog, end quote, provides the exhibit. So just right here, guys, see how the prosecution refers to John O'Keefe's dog bite and claw marks as abrasions. They were not abrasions, guys. They were punctures. They were scratches. There is a difference between an abrasion and bite marks and claw marks and punctures. And if you remember that other video I went over with Lori Reese, her YouTube channel, where she made the determination that John O'Keefe had been standing after he was bleeding. He was standing while he was bleeding. Lori Reese also made the determination that John O'Keefe's clothing, his own clothing themselves, had puncture marks, evidence of having been punctured. Okay? So his clothing and his body have evidence of puncture marks, not abrasions. It's just the prosecution continuing with their bullshit. Continuing. Argument. The Commonwealth moves that this court reconsider its finding that Dr. Russell was qualified to render an opinion in the defendant's first trial, and that the methodology or theory underlying her opinion, particularly without any corroborating evidence, was reliable. Okay. An expert witness is not permitted to testify to matters beyond an area of expertise or competence, provides a case law. The Commonwealth asserts that Dr. Russell is not qualified to render an opinion about the victim's injuries, nor is her opinion reliable, and respectfully requests a Daubert-Lanigan hearing to assess whether the defendant may call Dr. Russell in her second trial, provides a case law. So just pulling away from this, guys, it is clear, again, that the prosecution doesn't want to get down to the truth. They want to present the opportunity. They want to open the pathway for the possibility of Dr. Russell not testifying at all for the retrial. The prosecution does not want a dog expert at all. Continuing. The role of expert testimony is to assist jurors in interpreting evidence that lies outside their common experience. It is the defendant's burden to establish Dr. Russell's testimony, quote, will assist the trier of fact to understand the evidence or to determine a fact in issue, end quote. And that the methodology or theory underlying the expert testimony is sufficiently reliable to be presented for the jury's consideration, provides the case law. And another, I'll read the parentheses, quote, proponent must establish a sufficient foundation for a judge to determine whether the expert's opinion satisfies gatekeeper reliability, end quote. Now, pulling away, guys, where was this when the prosecution allowed Trooper Joe Paul to testify as an accident reconstructionist expert? Like I'm saying, guys, the prosecution has had one hypocritical move after another. They are allowed to not have their shit together. The prosecution is allowed to not have it all together, to be disorganized, to delay the discovery, to have discovery still taking place during trial, to have someone who is clearly uninformed and uneducated like Trooper Joe Paul to make the determination that Karen Reed struck John O'Keefe at 12:45 a.m. while she was also at John O'Keefe's house at 12:36 a.m. But Trooper Joe Paul couldn't provide any numbers or any calculations. To quote Trooper Joe Paul, his own words were, "It just did. How did John O'Keefe's body get there?" Quote, Trooper Joe Paul, "It just did." So This dog bite expert, Dr. Russell, who's actually a doctor and actually an expert, provides compelling testimony, far more compelling than Trooper Joe Paul ever did. But the prosecution has an issue with it because they don't have dog bite marks or claw marks in their narrative. But it's perfectly okay for the prosecution to have someone like Joe Paul testify as an expert for accident reconstruction when in fact the entire world witnessed how not an expert Trooper Joe Paul is. Not an expert. Absolutely not an expert. So the prosecution's allowed to get away with appointing fake experts on the stand to waste everyone's time. But when the defense has an actual expert, a compelling expert with actual experience in dog bite and claw marks, the prosecution doesn't want that expert to speak again. The prosecution wants to silence Dr. Russell. Yep. Massachusetts logic right there. Massachusetts logic. Continuing, quote, the crucial issue in determining whether a witness is qualified to give an expert opinion is whether the witness has sufficient education, training, experience, and familiarity with the subject matter of the testimony, end quote. But again, pulling away, but again, did Trooper Joe Paul have education, training, and experience and familiarity with accident reconstruction, with reverse engineering, with physics at all? He did not. But the prosecution and the MSP got away with having him as their, quote, expert. It continues, although Dr. Russell is a trained emergency room physician, the defendant has failed to prove that Dr. Russell has, quote, a reliable basis in the knowledge and experience of her discipline, end quote, to render an opinion in the field of canine bites or claw marks, veterinary medical science, forensic odontology, or canine behavior. Most of Dr. Russell's canine experience was from 28 years ago and focused on law enforcement canines in a 1996 article, quote, Managing Law Enforcement Canine Dog Bites in the Emergency Department, end quote, Exhibit 5. During her trial testimony, Dr. Russell conceded there was no law enforcement canine involved, and in her experience, a bite and hold injury that law enforcement canines are trained to do would appear different than a domestic canine and arguably vastly different from the victim's minor abrasions, which were isolated to one area of his forearm. Minor abrasions, guys. Like, we all saw John O'Keefe's arm, and if you didn't, you can just go back to some of my older videos. There are a couple of videos where John O'Keefe's arm is shown. You can also Google it. You can also search on DuckDuckGo. Just search John O'Keefe's dog bites and it will come up. Those are not minor abrasions. And remember, Adam Lally, the prosecution during the first trial, Massachusetts versus Karen Reed, Adam Lally began his opening statement claiming that John O'Keefe had one reason for the abrasions on his arm, and then Adam Lally ended his closing argument with another reason as to how John O'Keefe had those injuries to his arm. Adam Lally, who is not an expert, came to the conclusion that John O'Keefe had those injuries to his arm because of a taillight. The prosecution's allowed to do whatever the hell they want to do. They're allowed to say and literally speak out of their asses whenever they want to. But when the defense continues to provide expert after expert after expert, the prosecution has an issue with it. Like, who would have an issue with science having the last word? someone who wants the lie to have the last word. Like, screw your science, screw your reverse engineering, screw your expertise and experience in these particular fields. The prosecution is going to have the last word, even when their word is shit. Continuing. While Dr. Russell may be able to provide expertise on how one would treat or provide wound care, she lacks sufficient expertise in identifying characteristics of a canine bite, predominantly from an autopsy photograph. Dr. Russell has also no training in forensic animal odontology, nor any training or expertise in animal behaviors or domestic animal attacks, with only anecdotal experience and no corroborating evidence. Dr. Russell should not be permitted to testify that the injury depicted was specifically caused by a, quote, large dog, end quote, consistent with, quote, teeth or claw marks, end quote, and that there were, quote, puncture marks, end quote, puncture marks, little round marks inflicted by the actual point of the tooth, end quote. Like, again, the prosecution fights dirty, they play dirty, and Hank Brennan plays dirty. And they ignore the testimony of the other doctor that the defense provided, who also said that the marks on John O'Keefe's arm appeared to be bite or claw marks. All right, continuing. A jury should not be permitted to consider such speculative evidence. Such speculative evidence, people, coming from the prosecution. That's right. A jury should not be permitted to consider such speculative evidence. But the prosecution can provide speculative evidence anytime it wants to. So clearly. Continuing, a Daubert-Lanigan requires that this court determine whether the expert's conclusions have a reliable factual basis and are limited only to matters within Dr. Russell's precise field of expertise, provides the case law. A proposed expert's opinion should be disregarded, quote, where it amounts to no more than mere speculation or a guess from subordinate facts that do not give adequate support of the conclusion reached, end quote, provides the case law. Again, Trooper Joe Paul, prosecution. Trooper Joe Paul. And let's not forget Ian Whiffen either, because Ian Whiffen, who testified on behalf of the prosecution and also owns and operates ArtX, Ian Whiffen didn't even rely on the hash values when he obtained the data extractions from the cell phones. Ian Whiffen testified as an expert to the data extractions, even though it was impossible for him to verify the data extractions as being the original data extractions because he had no hash values. So I say again, the prosecution is allowed to appoint anybody as an expert witness whose credibility is actually questionable. But the defense provides compelling expert witnesses with credibility that is not questionable, credibility that is rather compelling, but the prosecution has an issue with it because it counters the prosecution's narrative. And notice that the prosecution's narrative completely leaves out John O'Keefe's dog bite and claw marks. The prosecution wants to lie to everybody and pretend that John O'Keefe was never attacked by a dog when he died. Continuing. The, quote, knowledge, end quote, of a proposed expert must indicate, quote, more than subjective belief or unsupported speculation, end quote. More hypocrisy from the prosecution. Continuing. Furthermore, Dr. Russell's opinion is in dispute with forensic findings that there was no canine DNA associated with the swabs taken from the area of the victim's clothing near the abrasions. Dr. Russell had failed to review the UC Davis veterinary genetics DNA report prior to rendering her opinion and testifying at the voir dire hearing. Dr. Russell testified that she did review the DNA report indicating there was no canine DNA present. However, her opinion did not change. This court need not and should not admit unreliable opinion testimony based only upon the expert's unsupported assertions and desire to render an opinion that, quote, resolves, end quote, an unsubstantiated and defense-driven, quote, controversy, end quote. Oh, the prosecution is so full of it. They're so full of themselves. And I will say this again. If you just read the prosecution's filings and Judge Beverly Cannoni's filings, they are so often in the same energy. This, like, antagonistic approach to whatever the defense is doing. Like that everything that the defense has ever done is blasphemous. Like the prosecution and Judge Bev have a documented shared hatred for the defense. I'll read the case law they cited. I'll read this in parentheses. Defendant must demonstrate facts sufficient to enable the witness to give an opinion that is not merely speculation. But again, Ian Whiffen and Joe Paul, they didn't give the jury speculative conclusions with their unverified testimony. Continuing. In addition to whether Dr. Russell is qualified, this court must also determine that expert's testimony is sufficiently reliable to reach the jury. As the proponent of the evidence, the defendant must prove by a preponderance of the evidence that Dr. Russell's methods and processes behind her opinion, despite a lack of any corroborating evidence are scientifically reliable, provides a case law. In Lanigan, the Supreme Judicial Court adopted a portion of the Supreme Court's ruling in Daubert and held that, quote, general acceptance in the relevant scientific community will continue to be the significant and often the only issue, but that a proponent of scientific opinion evidence must demonstrate the reliability or validity of the underlying scientific theory or process by some other means, end quote. The proponent of the evidence may establish reliability by demonstrating general acceptance of the methodology in the relevant scientific community or by applying a non-exclusive list of Daubert factors, including whether the scientific theory or process has general acceptance in the relevant scientific community, has been or can be subjected to testing, has been subjected to peer review and publication, has an unacceptably high known or potential rate of error, and is governed by recognized standards. General acceptance in the relevant community continues to be sufficient to establish the reliability regardless of other Daubert factors, provides a case law. And, quote, the touchstone of admissibility is reliability, end quote. But again, the prosecution, the touchstone of admissibility is reliability. And so the prosecution wants to say that every witness the prosecution brought forward was reliable. Continuing. Quote, if the process or theory underlying an expert's opinion lacks reliability, that opinion should not reach the trier of fact, end quote. Dr. Russell claimed no scientific or technical basis for her opinion and offered little more than anecdotal experience and vague generalizations. Ugh. Okay, I'm going to read that again, but I'm going to put Trooper Joe Paul, in place of Dr. Russell's name. So, Trooper Joe Paul claimed no scientific or technical basis for his opinion and offered little more than anecdotal experience and vague generalizations. There, prosecution, I fixed it for you. Not Dr. Russell, Joe Paul. Continuing, during trial testimony, this court sustained several objections during Dr. Russell's direct examination as Dr. Russell attempted to set forth her opinion and she lacked any reliable methodology or explanation for assessing how it could be opined that the abrasion was from a canine versus a different animal or versus a blunt force object. I'm gonna, before I continue, like this part, this court sustained several objections. What does that have to do with anything? Judge Bev sustained lots of objections for the prosecution, which only proved her corruption. This court sustained several objections during Dr. Russell's direct examination. And yeah, but what does that mean? Nothing, because clearly the world witnessed that Judge Bev was on the prosecution's side. But here is the prosecution. Here is Hank Brennan and Adam Lally again claiming that because Judge Bev sustained their objections, they're allowed to give the world the reason why the court sustained all of their objections. And look, this is the reason that the prosecution is alleging that Judge Bev sustained all of their objections as Dr. Russell attempted to set forth her opinion and she lacked any reliable methodology or explanation of assessing how it could be opined that the abrasions was from a canine versus a different animal. First of all, so many objections were sustained or allowed, depending on Judge Beverly Cannoni's mood. But by and large, Judge Bev gave the prosecution the floor. She allowed them to talk out of their asses. And she so often overruled the defense's objections so that the prosecution's narrative could prevail. To me, it's inappropriate and just further proves the corruption here that the prosecution wants to point out how the judge was on their side and agreed with them because she kept sustaining their objections. Oh, it's such shit. Like I said, they're fighting dirty. Continuing, how she could assess the size of the supposed canine and what her methodology was to opine. There were puncture marks from the points of a tooth, but also quite possibly a claw. No methodology was even alluded to within her testimony at any point. Right. Just like no methodology was alluded to during Trooper Joe Paul's testimony, but the prosecution allowed him to waste everybody's time. What methodology would there be when you are speaking to an expert witness who has witnessed hundreds, if not thousands, of bite marks and claw marks over the years? And not just her, but the other doctor as well. He too testified that the marks on John O'Keefe's body appeared to be bite or claw marks. And why is it difficult to differentiate a dog bite from a dog claw mark? We're talking about punctures. A claw can puncture, and so too can a tooth. A tooth can also scrape and scratch, and so too can a claw. They can do the same things. And when it comes to dogs, their teeth and their claws tend to be about the same size, depending on the tooth, right? And depending on the dog, depending on their paws. Either way, we are talking about puncture marks, not abrasions. And it's like, does it really matter if they were teeth marks or claw marks when in fact there are punctures, and when in fact it appears that it was done by an animal? It does not appear that an SUV backed into him. Continuing. The court must limit its analysis to reliability of the methodology suggested, not the perceived persuasiveness of a proposed expert's conclusions, particularly one that Dr. Russell is not qualified to make, which is not supported by evidence nor scientific reliability, and was born 6 weeks into trial. Again, the prosecution putting it on the defense that they just obtained her during trial, like the prosecution had their shit together during trial when they did not. The discovery was delayed and was occurring while trial was going on. The discovery is supposed to be concluded before trial so that both sides know what their game plan is going to be. I'm telling you, this filing was throwing so much shade on the defense, but with so much hypocrisy on the prosecution's part. Continuing, the conclusion. For the foregoing reasons, the Commonwealth respectfully requests that the defendant satisfy her burden of establishing Dr. Marie Russell's proposed testimony meets the requirements set forth in Daubert versus Merrill, and that the testimony of Dr. Marie Russell be excluded at the defendant's upcoming trial. And that's what they're really asking for, is what is in the last sentence, the last part of the sentence, and that the testimony of Dr. Marie Russell be excluded at the defendant's upcoming trial. That's what they're really saying. And to me, if the prosecution is going to require a Daubert hearing for all of the defense's expert witnesses, then I think the defense should require a Daubert hearing for all of the prosecution's expert witnesses. It should be the same standard applied to both sides. But again, we know Judge Bev. We know. And she already approved this in a way because she scheduled the Daubert hearing. And we will be hearing about that Daubert hearing relatively soon. So it was submitted by Hank Brennan, Adam Lally, and Laura McLaughlin, December 1st, 2024. So again, I will leave the link in the description below if you'd like to read it yourself. I get so triggered reading shit from the prosecution. Just zero integrity. If there's anything we can rely on the prosecution for, it's the absence of integrity. Thank you for watching.